Hello, people. So, tonight I'm going to be doing an overview and roll through this whole argument real quick. Since there seems to still be, quite thankfully, some people with educated and informed skepticism, which drives better explanation. So, despite any inadequacies of just the text medium, I am thankful for anyone who posts comments that are educated and informed while being skeptical. So let me walk through this little bit here. We have a couple of things. First, the regular one, we're just going to go through it. The idea being, to prove the Collatz conjecture, you need to show, one, that this 3 times 1, or 3 times n, 3n plus 1, 3 times an odd plus 1, when you take the 2's away, when you take all even factors out, the remaining odd, if there is one, will always multiply back and then converge to 0, or converge to the trivial loop, which is the 1, 4, 2 loop. 1, 4, 2, 1, 1, 4, 2, 1. And it does that. So in order to show you that, you got to show 1, right? Loops, if there is any, can only be that one, or there can't be any others, right? You can show that that one loops, or show that somehow no others do. There's some issues with dealing with infinities and not having them probabilistic in some sort of nature, or taking limits at infinity. So there's always going to be a little bit there. But let's go with that. So you need to show there is none, or you can show that there's all that sort of stuff, or you need to show that the behavior doesn't allow for anything else, such as that it will always hit a power of 2 in that it can't repeat one of its sequences, meaning that if it there isn't a loop of larger than just one, or not significantly larger than just one step, like you go 10 steps later and it returns you to another value. So there's going to be some problems with that. You have the runaway that just always goes up to infinity, or you have one that just wanders between some other values infinitely. Essentially never hits them, but it basically continues around some average value, like an attractor. Right? Those are the things that it has to come back to a power of 2 and then divide by 2 all the time, and then you'll come back to 1. First things first, showed in previous videos, run through the argument real quick. 3 times an odd. Anyone who doesn't like my notation, you're probably jealous. 3 times an odd plus 1. Okay, right here. We also know that that's possibly an even number, right? Power 2. If this is power 2, so is that. If you can't figure out that these are the only 2 expressions in this columnated set here that can have a power of 2, you're not going to understand the rest of this. So just come along for the ride. I'm not going to explain it now. This is, after you get rid of all the powers of 2, there's this expression that is related to this very same x that made it odd. And it kicks out. Not only that, but I've shown previously that you can take this very same expression, know that it's going to be odd, replace it as in here, find that x, and it will regurgitate the next odd in the Collatz sequence every time, all the way down to 5. It's repeatable through using this. You don't need to know the evens because it might be a little different, but if you know that if this should be, if it were true, right? Always going to be here, pretty algebraically easy to verify, and the replacement works all the way down to 5. Let's talk about that a little bit here for just a second, and then I'll get to the last argument, which should take care of all the infinite arguments about it always being able to go. So we'll take care of the loops first, establishing that we can do this replacement is first. We'll take care of the loops, meaning by 2 things by loops, here's what I mean, meaning no one input will give an output that will later derive the same input, right? Like a go-to loop. Go, blah, 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 do, blah, 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 while, blah, 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 and then you make an infinite loop. There, to show that there's no infinite loop possible in the odds, or that the odds never repeat. Can only repeat or cause two solutions to the equations in an odd input, right? So we'll go through this first. There's an identity crisis. 3 times an odd. Here's an odd. This is also 3 times an even. 3 times 0. This is the 0 case, right? 6 times 1. So we'll do a 0 case. 3 times a 0 is 3 times 1. Hey, guess what? That's 3. So 0 case works. 3 times 1 is 3 plus 2. Hey, 5. Guess what? The 0 case. Okay. Take a look at this particular. So we got first number goes to 4. By definition, guess what? Second number, it's an even number. Goes to 4, it collapses. 3 goes to 4. This is one loop. And it is there because it's the 0 case. It's a trivial case, but it's a 0 case. This is the first one, even though it's a 0 case, it's plus 2, where you need to get to this number either by input or by some other division. You need to say what happens if we start with 5, or you need to start at something like 10, or some 10, 20, 40, 80, right? Some other power of 2 to 5. This is the first one that you have to get outside of the 0 case. 3 times 1 plus 1. Okay, 3 times, well, it can't be 2 because that wouldn't be odd. But the x can. That's 3 times 5. Right, so you can put other numbers in here. How do you get to 3? Well, 2 times 1 when x equals 1. 3 times 3 plus 1 is 10. Hey, there it is. We get back to 5. So there's the one case, right? When x equals 1 here, when x equals 0, you get this loop. When x equals 1, you hit 5. Real simple. From that point on, it expands. But the 0 case has a loop. It has a bit of an identity crisis. Again, if you take this rule in between these two, you get 2 solutions. Right? You get a solution for 1, you get a solution for 2. If you make it so that you don't have to divide again, it's there. This should show different solutions. 2 different solutions. Like you get up here. I'll show you this in a little, and that's where I get to the next little bit. You set these to even. Here's the process I was just discussing. The single cycle, right? A single cycle recurve. Or recursion, probably the better. Single cycle recursion, probably the better term. So you go 3 times whatever odd minus 1, which would be this column. 3 times an odd minus 1, or 3 times an odd plus 1. These are the 2 powers of 2. So we're going to look at these. This one we know we can do a quick arithmetic progression and know this one has a loop at 5 and 7. We can see why. 3 times an odd minus 1 equals 2 times some other value, right? Some even number. We're talking about where we start talking about things like where you have, you know, also n equals 2x, right? We start talking about things like this, and also n equals 2x. To make the even numbers, right? We're generating even numbers. Just to make that clear. So now we've got an even number. We need it to be, right? We know it's going to be an even number. Minus 1 or plus 1. Going to be an even freaking number. Has to be. It doesn't take a lot. 3 times an odd number is an odd number. 1 away from that on either side is an even number. There's a million ways to prove it. So you divide by 2. If it fulfills this, you've got one of your numbers. Actually, you got both. You know, n, like say we put n equals 5. 3 halves of 5, half of 5 is 2.5. 3 of that is 7.5. Minus a half is 7. Well, now we need to come back here. So 1 cycle, 3 times 7 minus 1 is equal to 2 times a power of this, a multiple of 2, you know, some power of 2 to this n, which we can quickly verify arithmetically. 3 times 7, 21, minus 1 is 20. That's 4 times 5. 2 squared equals n. This very same thing can be that you divide by 2, you get, guess what? An even number possibility, but an odd possibility follows that. As a gets larger, that tends to 0. When you're talking about infinities, that slope is going to intersect only the 0 line as a goes to infinity. The number of solutions that can possibly be goes to 0. So your biggest, best possibility solution is this single cycle recursion. And so that's what it would do. It could be some power, or you could have some more. And this would be true, right? This process, sometime later, it doesn't matter what number, this can be single cycle or later, it's going to be some power of 2. And the larger that power is, the less likely it's going to have any solutions, much less integer solutions. Once you get below 1, you have 0 integer solutions anyway. Once you're at 1, you have 1. Once the slope of this line becomes basically less than 1 or fractional value less than 1, you have no integer solutions anyway. But let's just take so we've got that. That's this one. We know that we can see that there's a loop, 5 and 7. You can see, right? Illustrates the behavior. Doesn't take long to look at this. 3 halves times some number minus a half is 1 integer less. And here we can do it with 5 again, an odd number. 3 times 5, or 3 halves times 5, I mean, is 2.5 times 3, 7.5, plus a half is 8. That's an even number. Can we get 3 times an even number plus 1 to equal an even number? Or do we have to go, wait, we need to divide by 2 times some power times 3 times a variable that we know is, well, in this case, even, but it doesn't really matter, times some variable plus 1. Hey, we know that, right? So I start 3 times an odd plus 1 in this column, and I get here for the next n, not an odd number. Now you can get an odd number here, and it will follow this very same thing. 5 doesn't loop, obviously, but what it does is evens. Evens can loop here, but they only loop on this one column. It's like that. One column. If you get an even, if you get an even, right, you get an even bit right up here, you need to divide by 2 and all that sort of stuff. You can't get an even number from 3 times an even plus that. Is really the big argument there. There's ways you can talk about like this particular thing, you know, that's a negative. You can do like, you know, hey, what if it equals this, right? What if it equals this? What if it equals an even number? Which, you know, you get what if n is actually that before you know, all that sort of thing. What if you divide by 2? That means you multiply by 2. Blah, blah, blah. There's all sorts of stuff here. But anyway, these really are the slopes that are important when it gets to something like this, right? Where you have like, or I shouldn't have got rid of the whole a. This is essentially what you're looking for. This is the real slope. This, like, you can see that this one, they'll both put you right here, but this one starts out in an even column, comes to here. and you'll find that it loops on evens. That being said, more important is there's no odd loops. It never comes back to the starting value. This n can be odd, but it's not the same one you started with. If you started with 7, you'll get a different number here. So that's the behavior necessary for loops. So that's the equations that govern it. As a tends towards infinity, the slope of that line tends towards 0. Extremely small times whatever plus an extremely small is really close to 0. So the solutions have to be close. It can probably even be shown that A is probably going to be less than or equal to 2. But that's just a presumption. All that said, a couple of things just to go over. We have a repeatable sequence, meaning that it's additive. Right? Meaning that if there's an infinite solution, there's an infinite number of infinite solutions, meaning that any step in the process would also, it's repeatable and additive. So any step in the process would also be infinite. Right? So there would be an infinite number of them. If there is one infinite solution, there's an infinite number of infinite solutions. That's a big pill to take down. So let's start paring it down a little bit. I'm actually going to take the fact that we know that it doesn't repeat odds. It doesn't repeat odds. You're not going to get the same thing because you'll get a loop. You'll go back and forth. We only see it here on evens. It returns an even. It doesn't return an odd. This one can loop. It can repeat the sequence. This one won't. So it doesn't repeat odds. That's important to note, right? It doesn't repeat an odd. It makes a new odd. So we'll use a reverse calculus type argument, right? If this were to go on forever but never repeat, and it's only going through odds, given any subsection of the infinite sequence of odds and enough time, it would run through every odd in that sequence. It's never going to miss one. That would be what would happen if it was infinite, right? It would infinitely go for an infinite amount of time until it ran through every single possible odd in that small section of the possible odds. Say 11 to 33. We're just taking a small section. If it'll go through the small section, we can start building it up, just like we would build down in calculus down to the smallest. You can say the same thing about any infinite section of the odds. It will eventually, since it never ends, it never repeats, and it's always choosing new, there's only two options. It starts at some level and goes up forever, which is we'll talk about that in a minute, or it doesn't. If it doesn't, it would scan through every possible odd value of any value, so long as it always stayed rising. You wouldn't see it any lower. If it drops down and comes back up and goes wildly, that means its lowest value is still an infinite value. It would have to be lower than anything ever tested. And since it never repeats, every value would eventually be reached. There would be a threshold where every odd number would lead to an infinite value. You can test, it's been tested to something like 100,000 digits or 100 million digits or big numbers. Seems to be true. So we know just from testing that it would have to be bigger than that. But there would have to be a threshold where every odd number after that would be an infinite sequence. It would always continue rising but never switch, which means It may go up and down. If it's always rising, then every number after that will always be infinite. If it goes up and down, if it goes below its own value, then any number below it would have been infinite. There's no possibility for an infinite sequence. If there is an infinite sequence, it will eventually have to be argued that every odd number could present an infinite sequence. Or there's a threshold which every number above it is an infinite sequence because that particular number only climbs. If there's one infinite sequence, there has to be an infinite number of them. And if there's an infinite number of them and it does anything like drop down, then that number's infinite. And if it's there, then then it would have been before. Then there's no threshold. It would have been a lower threshold. So it can only climb, which means there's a threshold where this doesn't hold true. And it would have to be large. But this tends to 0. The slope of these lines, no matter which one, this one can have an internal loop, but it's still going to tend to 0. This slope tends to 0. So if it's up there, it's not infinite. There's no odd loop at the large size. The single greatest possibilities here are when A is small. That's not just probabilities, that's possibilities. So if there's one infinite sequence, they're all an infinite sequence. Or there's a threshold at which they're all infinite sequences. And that one particular number has to rise constantly. It can't dip below its own value. It can never dip below its own value, or there would be a lower threshold. So any argument that says it can still run off to infinity has neglected to take into account the fact that it can't. The repeatability of it and the additive nature of it means that if there's one, then there's an infinite number. And if there's an infinite number, there has to be a point at which that infinite starts. That threshold value has to continue climbing, which means this solution wouldn't have loop, or these slopes, these are linear equations. Right? These are values you can see. This has a lot of odd integer. This has a lot of even. There's loops on evens. And this basically has none. This has no odd solutions. No odd solutions. 3 times an even plus 1 is odd. 2 times any power of 2 times a number is even. This has no solutions. So how can it climb? Where's the threshold for infinity? Within this equation system. There isn't one. They're additive. There's a minimum threshold for the infinite number of solutions. And from that point on, every solution's infinite. It would be absolutely necessary for the conditions that we can easily show and prove that, it just takes an easy run through that it is an additive thing. That if you come to 5, you know that there's only, every time you run 5, no matter how many times you do it, it's the same number of steps. It doesn't change. It doesn't randomize itself. It is a finite series. And while you can make it of any arbitrary but finite length, they will always be of finite length. Even though that length can be long and huge. That sounds wrong. Even though that length can be very, 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 very... It can be a lot. It can be a lot. It's still going to be finite. Because if there's one infinite, then there's an infinite number. And it either needs a threshold or it would be every odd number is an infinite solution. There's either a threshold where every odd number is a solution, is an infinite solution after that, some lowest number, or every odd number is an infinite solution. We know that every odd number is an infinite solution, so there must be a threshold. And this would be the behavior necessary. Low numbers don't do it. That's where the biggest probability is. High numbers tend towards zero. And I know there's people who don't like the probabilistic, the calculus at the limit, man. As A approaches infinity, N approaches zero. There's no solutions for those slopes, and there's zero solutions for that set of equations. Three times an even number is an even number. And that's an odd. And that's an even. So odd does not equal even, ever. So it's repeatable. Any individual iteration can't ever be infinite, or there must be an infinite number or a threshold. Well, there must be an infinite number or a threshold for the infinite at which every other infinite is, and it must be large. By just doing a few calculations, we can show that it must be larger than some just banal number of less than 100. And then we have the equations that show that anything that would be such a thing would require a slope like this. And as that approaches infinity, the solutions approach zero. The zero case is the loop, the primary loop. You can do a zero case here, right? 3/2 times, or you can even do the 1, right? 0. X equals 0. 3/2 times 1 plus a half. 2. 3/2 times 1 minus a half is 1. So you got 1, you got 2. Right? You can see the odd kick out. You can see the even. There, you can substitute values in here, but you can't make an even number turn out. There, you can get odd numbers where there is this solution. You can get odd numbers, but they always kick out. And we can show that this one will do it all the way to 5. Everything below the initial bit, everything where this isn't 0, where this isn't odd. 3 times 1 plus 2, 5. That's the 0 case for X, but it's 3 times 1. It's the 10. It's 10. I don't know how to make it more plain than that. This is the basis for the whole thing. It can't repeat on anything but evens. This one can repeat on odds. It can't forever rise, or there'll be a threshold where everything is infinite, every odd is infinite, and it would have to be large, which these equations would seem to prevent. And you can easily fill in. This would be what they would need to look like. That there would be some value that would return your initial starting value. And the slope of that line, those values go down the bigger that A gets. Which would mean the bigger the gap in the steps necessary, the lower the number of values are that it would allow it to loop. Right? So you got to either have the best values here, whereas this is saying the opposite. Can't do that on there's none when this is even. It'll loop back to evens. It'll loop on evens. And when it's odd, you get a line that doesn't return the same starting value. And you can easily check it. For any internal value, you don't get the same starting value. Just like you can find these. You can see that there's odds. 9, 13, 5, 7. There's several, God, what is this? Like, so like 13 and 21 or something? Or no. There's other ones too. I forget what they all are. But there's integers that can solve these equations. There's integers along that line. There's integer solutions for that equation. But that n is not necessarily the starting value, especially here. And they tend towards 0 as it gets bigger, which we already know if it's going to run to infinity, it gets bigger. We've tested it to millions of digits, or at least thousands. You can do it to just a few. And this will quickly become big, right? That quickly starts to become like a power of 10, no problem. 2 to the 10th, it's 100. Or no, it's that's 10 to the 2. I'm not going to do that anymore. Anyway, yeah, you can see 2 as this gets larger, like 2 to the 5th, right? It's like 32. Start getting to those. Slope starts going towards 0 really fast. So it would have to be in short steps, small values of 2, that there is a loop, and anything that runs off, and if there's and that would be an infinite solution, and anything that runs off to infinity would have to have an infinite number. And whichever one actually runs off to infinity, it can't ever dip below its own value. Ever. It can go up and then back down, but it can't ever go below its own value. And from that value up, if it's infinite, it would eventually reach, since it doesn't repeat and can go up, if it comes back down but never goes below, it would eventually reach every odd number because it never repeats. It would either run off to infinity, at which point, how? Saying that it comes back here and would only hit on an even value by changing the input. If it doesn't hit the power of 2, it changes the input. It's like selective evolution. You don't have to worry about repeating values, causing the same one on randomness or anything like that. You never have to worry about repeating. It's going through a new odd every run until it finds one that is a power of 2. It will run through every odd, which will eventually get you powers of 2. Any even, which we know this will pull out, will get you a power of 2. And eventually it'll run through the odds to get you a power of 2. Eventually. Especially if it doesn't run off to infinity, meaning that we do have a confined space where it will run, there's a maximum that it can go to before it actually runs into it, because it keeps going and finds a new power. Multiplied by 3, eventually you would run through the entire thing of an odd. If you had any odd, you would eventually move it through the sequence. From here to here, from here to here to here, to anywhere else, times an even number, times an odd number. Doesn't really matter. The infinite sequence would have to have a threshold and then never go below its value again. And it would have to be huge. And if this is low and x is huge, n has to be huge. N has to be huge. Right? You can do a power of 2 on these too to even it out a little bit. You're essentially looking at the same line. If one is a large value, the other would have to be a large value. Or 2 would have to be A would have to be a large value where the solutions tend to 0. And the integer values are low. Integer values aren't big there, they're low. They'd have to be way, way down. Not sure what infinite agreement still stands up to that, or why you still think it's a matter of raw probability instead of constrained probability, or why anyone might. But there you are. As it goes towards there, it goes towards infinity. And in order for there to be a threshold, these need to be large, where this tends to 0. You have counterproductive bits. And this one will pull evens. I'm sure this probably can too, but I've only seen odds. I could be wrong about that. I don't know, for any odd, 3 times an odd, yeah, no. What is it, 3? I think 3 is the 1. N equals 3. Right? 1.5, 1.5, 4.5. That's 4. It's going to loop on 4. And this one produces 4.5 plus 1/2 is 5. You can get them. We also know what happens with 5. Right? 3 times 5 plus 1 is 16. It does make you an even number. So the only thing you can do is collapse. Or be divided to something like this. Takes an odd plus 1 is an even. You get this. Which means you get at least 2 divisions. So I'm going to take back what I said before about not being sure. I'm pretty sure now that I've walked through this again in my head and out loud that you'll always get 2 divisions when you substitute. You'll always be able to have 2. It'll always come from 4 down to this, down to that. So there it is. Can't loop. Can't have a recursion. That's not even. Can get an odd one here. But you have an even one here. You have an even recursion here. And there would have to be an established threshold that would solve this equation at a large value for x prime and n, and every value after it would also have to be infinite. Every odd value after it would also have to be infinite. Neglecting powers of 2, even. Let's just neglect that argument that there's going to be an odd, that it'll somehow skip that. Let's neglect that. The number of solutions vastly expands as it gets larger, and the number of solutions here vastly diminishes as it gets larger. There's several counterintuitive and counterproductive arguments for infinity that just are mutually exclusive. There would have to be one solution that did the line, and we can already establish that if there's one infinite solution, there's an infinite number of them. No recursion, no infinite, and it'll run through all the odds within a bounded field because it doesn't repeat and it changes value and never has a recursion until it runs through all the odds within a particular space, which will include there and can also include some evens. Powers of 2. Right? Other even powers of 2. It just has to run through a bounded section of the possible odd space to do it without ever repeating, without ending until it does. And the rules of the conjecture, the rules of the Collatz algorithm forbid it to. So the only thing it can do is find a power of 2 and then collapse. That's what it does. It can't run off to infinity, which would keep it from collapsing. It can't have an odd recursion, which would keep it from collapsing. And any infinite solution would have to have massively more solutions as it gets large instead of massively smaller solutions. And we can't have just a single infinite solution. There has to be an infinite number of them. So we can't have a single infinite solution except for a trivial case, which we can show is true in the case of 1. 3 times 2 plus 1. Oh, wait, here. This is, 1 and 2. 2. This is an even number. 3 times 2 plus 1. 7. It's not odd. It's not going to loop. You can do this one thing. If n equals 0, this can be true. This right here. You can either x or x prime, this can be, or sorry, x prime can be 0. In this case, when you get an even, x prime 0 is a solution for any power of 2. Three times 0 is 0. Minus 1 is negative 1. That's a negative power of 2. Minus 2. Minus 4. Minus 8. Three times an odd minus 1. There isn't one here. It's only down here in the negatives. There's the algebraic solutions and the arguments behind them. No infinite runner, and the probability of it goes down while it needs to go up. No repeat on the odd outputs, and since it takes its own inputs, it cycles through all of the odds within a given bounded section. That means it has to find a power of 2 and collapse. Because it'll always be searching through this column with a new input that doesn't repeat. Because that, if it repeated, then there would be a recursion. It's not going to go to an infinite number. It can go to an arbitrary high, but it's not going to go infinitely high. So you're not going to be able to go to an infinite space without 2s. It's always going to start coming back down. There's Terence Tao's proof about how it does tend towards 0. You can look at this and say, yeah, it tends, the solutions to this tends towards 0 as far as the loop and all stuff. And he showed that this tends towards 0 for any given. So it does go down. It doesn't stay even. Can't go up. We just established that. And again, if it stayed even, that would be actually staying even or going up, right? So it goes down. Kind of just established that any threshold would have to be a threshold of even or above, and then there would be an infinite number, and this really precludes it, so that kind of only allows it to go down, doesn't it? I just thought of that. That's a new argument. So yeah, what makes it go to 2? No recursion, no repeat, no infinite riser. That's all of them. That's the Collatz conjecture, and that's the truth of it. Now I gotta put it in a paper. See if I can win something for a change. Instead of just pray.